Welcome everyone, and we hope you have been having an enriching day 2 of ICDRI 2023 so far. Greetings from New Delhi. We've had immersive discussions so far on day 1, and coming into day 2, I would like to briefly introduce this session, which is on building infrastructure of the future, innovative financing instruments and collaborations. By 2050, 2/3 of humanity will be urban, and 3/4 of the infrastructure needed by that time is yet to be built. Growing interconnectedness, increasing populations, and the implications of climate change all add up to the pressing need for sustainable and resilient infrastructure systems. In this session, the distinguished panel members shall be bringing together international and local experiences to discuss opportunities and solutions for innovative financing to fund resilient infrastructure systems of the future. It is my pleasure to introduce the moderator of this session, Dr. Charlotte Benson. She is the Unit Head, Disaster Risk Management at the Asian Development Bank in Manila. She has an experience of over 3 decades working across economic and financial aspects of disaster risk management in developing countries, and she's also responsible for development and coordination of ADB's disaster risk management policies and strategies. Over to you, Dr. Benson, for commencing the session. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you very much for that introduction. I hope that the audience will fill out as we proceed. I think quite a few people are still taking some lunch, but we will crack on anyway. The clock is already ticking. We have what should have been a 75-minute session. We're already down to 68 minutes, so we're going to jump straight in. As you've heard, the focus of the discussion in this session is on financing, looking at financing solutions to ensure that future infrastructure systems are both sustainable and disaster resilient. We're going to focus specifically on how to attract, to enable, to secure more private sector financing for resilient infrastructure. This is clearly not an easy thing to do, to attract either public or private sector financing in view of the fact that disaster losses continue to increase. We're clearly not investing enough in resilience, whether it's in the incremental cost to ensure that particular types of infrastructure are built to adequate resilience standards, or to invest in specific risk management solutions such as, for instance, integrated flood risk management projects. There is clearly a role for the private sector as well as the public sector. Admittedly, not everything is bankable, but there are certainly opportunities where the private sector can come in. And as we've already heard today and yesterday, it's not necessarily costly to build resilience. Sometimes it's just a matter of doing things differently. It is imperative that we do better going forward, including by attracting more financing for resilience. And we very much hope that the 6 panelists we have joining us today are going to offer us some words of wisdom, some solutions to help move things forward. I will introduce all of the panelists briefly at this point, and then we will come to them one by one again to talk to each of them individually. So we have a very diverse, very illustrious group of panelists, 2 with us present in the room, and we have 4 further panelists online. These include Dr. Ila Patnaik, Chief Economist of the Aditya Birla Group, Henry Blass, also online, Chief Content Officer at the Global Infrastructure Hub. To my immediate left, Jaya Dindor, who is the Program Director of Integrated Urban Development at WRI India. Online, we have Vijay Kalavakonda, who is a Senior Financial Sector Specialist at IFC at the International Finance Corporation. Also online, we have Professor Ilan Noy, who is the Chair in the Economics and Disasters of Climate Change at the School of Economics and Finance, Victoria University of Wellington in New Zealand. And then last but by no means least, to my far left, we have Dr. Michael Spranger, who is a consultant with Miyamoto International. So what we're going to do is we will do a round of questions to the panelists. We will then open the session up for questions from the audience. I really encourage you to have those questions ready and waiting, including people online. I understand we should have a very good online number of participants. Please do put your questions into the chat box and we will present those to the panel. And then after that Q&A, we will then move on to a slightly more quick-fire round of questions before we wrap up. So I think we should jump straight in, given the time limitations and the huge experience amongst the panelists. And I'd like to begin, if I may, with Henry Blass, the Chief Content Officer at the Global Infrastructure Hub. So Henry, a fundamental question for you. In your opinion, is there now wide acceptance that infrastructure has to be built to adequate climate and disaster resilience standards? And if not, how can we strengthen the business case for building resilient infrastructure and securing the required financing? Thank you. Over to you, Henry.
Thank you, and hi everyone. It's good to see you, even virtually. So first, I mean, thanks for the question. I would love to say yes, that is wide acceptance. I think we're certainly in a much better place than we used to be, and I think there's general awareness that it should be the case, but there are obviously still many challenges. So obviously the Global Infrastructure Hub, we are this sort of specialized agency that was created by the G20 to help finance ministers in particular work on priorities around infrastructure in general, including on the resilience. So maybe, I mean, obviously I can't cover all the challenges, and I think the other panelists will do so as well. So I just wanted to sort of focus maybe on a couple of ones sort of relevant at the G20 this year. Obviously, India is the presidency this year, and actually as defined as one of the priority, one of the key challenge that is around taxonomies and data. There's been some recent progress, obviously, in understanding climate risk, in particular when it comes to corporate and government. But it's really difficult still for government and investors to understand resilience of assets, especially from a systemic risk perspective. And it's even harder to understand the contribution of assets to the overall resilience of the country. Obviously, that's where I think the systemic aspect is even more important. So definitions and data, they seem secondary, but actually they really help sort of drive investment towards the right type of infrastructure. And especially for long-term investors, they usually don't have the capacity to actually sort of look in details at each asset. So those definitions and data points are very critical in order to direct, I think, capital flows into the right, in the right type of assets and the right type of investments. One thing that's obviously has been very challenging in particular is defining what is resilient infrastructure, has sort of changed a little bit. I mean, we've seen during the pandemic, for example, that digital infrastructure, which was not thought to be so critical to resilience, actually came back to be on the critical aspect of infrastructure during COVID. And obviously, we're seeing a lot of the work and a lot of technology sort of evolving around the resilience of power systems, now that renewables sort of making a sort of bigger share of the energy generation. So all that to say, there's a lot of changes, but I don't want to also, I mean, not only focus on the new type of assets, even all the type of assets. If you take road, for example, government spend a huge amount of investment into roads, but it's actually kind of hard to define and to help sort of make the right decision and actually create resilience road and sort of drive the investments toward that. So that's really something that we're sort of keen to tackle this year with the G20 countries. There's also a lot of work as well with partners, CDRI, with the lexicon work, CPI, GRESB is also partners of us. And so again, really looking forward to sort of advance that work because that's critical for investors. And you know, if anyone in the audience is interested to sort of collaborate, I think we're very happy to sort of get inputs and sort of try to continue to work on with the G20. So just maybe a quick word on the G20 side. So last year what we did, we looked at all the investment plan across all the G20 countries. So beyond definition, if we look at what countries are actually doing when it comes to resilient infrastructure, are they really integrating that within the plans? I think definitely mitigation, climate mitigation is still way more understood. So all the plans, all the countries that we looked at, they had something on climate mitigation. Only half of the economies actually had long-term plans that included resilience and climate adaptation as one subset of that. And if you look at the total investment, there's still 3 times more that's sort of predicted to go towards mitigation as opposed to adaptation. And what we've seen is a lot of gaps as well. There's usually resilience is indicated for some sectors, but not others. So again, I think there is a general recognition that this is important, but unfortunately, we're still far away from understanding it and driving investments from financial market perspective, but also getting the governments to get the right understanding in order to develop the right plans to address those challenges. So that's basically where we are. Again, I think we're better than we were a few years ago, but we're not there. We're not there yet. So the second question is what was it that we could do about it? So besides the work that I've just mentioned on definition, I think what's really important is to try to help make again like a better case for investment. A lot of work has been done on assets, on risk, systemic risk across the entire sort of infrastructure space. And we've seen emerging some systemic risk assessment at the asset level, and those are really good. But I think for governments to really understand and to be able to address some of those risks, I think understanding the economic value at risk will be critical. So a few days ago, it's just been announced that we're going to take over the Secretariat of CCRI, and that's one of the key challenges that we're going to work on, is sort of leverage the great work that's been done by, again, CCRI or ADAC Infra on those topics, and try to sort of make it more palatable, I guess, for governments to really understand what's that risk there from an economic perspective, not just from an asset perspective. And I think the same goes for the private sector. I think there's willingness to invest in resilience, but the business case hasn't been done. There's not enough benchmarks, not enough data. And some of the work, the great work that CCRI had done in partnership with the private sector was to help build templates for private sector to be able to integrate some of those elements into the way they look at investments and be able to quantify the potential benefits. And in many cases, what they found is that the investment actually was not that significant, and the impact on the IRR is very, very, very small. But then if that risk, if the risk that we're trying to prevent against actually happen, the impact on the IRR will be much higher. So once you get that evidence, and you start having that type of data, I think it's going to make it a lot easier for governments, but also private sector, to be able to sort of make different decisions and incorporate resilience going forward. So I'll stop there. Hopefully that gives some area for discussion later. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Henry. And thanks particularly for acknowledging that we are actually in a better place than we used to be. We have a long way to go, but it's sometimes important to just take stock and recognize that we are at least moving forward, and to draw some inspiration to continue moving forward from that. I'd like to turn now to Dr. Ela Patnaik. You have huge experience in both the public and the private sectors. You were former Principal Economic Advisor to the Government of India, and now you work as Chief Economist for the Aditya Birla Group, a multinational firm which engages in a wide range of lines of business, including ones involved in the delivery of infrastructure. From your experience, what measures do you think governments can take to attract private sector investments in resilient infrastructure? And do you have some examples perhaps that you could share from India? Thank you.
Thank you for having me on the panel, and thanks for your question. I think I want to begin with answering the question about why there is a role for the government. Because from that, it follows what the government can do and what the government should be doing to get the private sector to invest. I think in many ways, it's very similar to the kind of framework that governments or central banks, regulators have for the financial sector. So because, infrastructure is something that has externalities. These externalities can be negative if there is disaster. The issues are also similar. The issue is one of assessing risk, of having data, of measuring the risk that is there in the system, continuously monitoring it. And the difficulties in doing that are again similar to that in the financial sector, and those are that there is asymmetric information. So you don't know, both at the time of construction of infrastructure or at the maintenance stage about what this risk is and how the world is changing and influencing whether that risk is increasing or decreasing. Now, the reason I draw that analogy is because the world came together, particularly after the G20, particularly after the global financial crisis, in the form of G20, to try to focus on reducing risk in the system, reducing risk for individuals, for households, for firms, and risk that was there in the system in various places. And therefore, we are able to kind of draw lessons from that. I think what needs to be done in infrastructure and how the government can actually make the system more resilient, as well as individual infrastructure projects more resilient, is to bring in a similar thinking into the space of infrastructure. So what needs to be done? One is regulation. And regulation has to be dynamic, not that standards get set once and then they don't change, but the way central banks do, they change leverage ratios, they change how much you can have exposure to each sector, what you can do, lend to somebody or not lend to certain groups or certain locations in this case. But not just, so I'm not talking about regulating just the finance. I'm talking about regulating the entire sector so that you have a view, you have an idea of where the risk is. You have standards for whether it's power sector, whether it is bridges, whether it is airports, wherever there is risk, and the regulator then can change regulations. The second element of such a regulatory framework would be supervision. You see, very often regulators can set standards, but the capacity to supervise whether those standards are being met or not needs to be done at the ground level. And that capacity requires the ability to check whether the information that has been provided is correct or not. This requires about 3 to 4 steps fundamentally. First, perhaps voluntary disclosures. And when those are complied with, you go to mandatory disclosures. I mean, that's how the problem of asymmetric information gets solved, that you ask for disclosures. And then later, you can move beyond disclosures to saying, okay, these are the standards. And if they are not met, then a project could be decommissioned. Or if the company that is maintaining, let's say a road, is able to, is providing continuous information, the supervisor should have the ability to check that that information is correct. Finally, even though we try to reduce risk, and again, the similar thing happens in the financial sector as well. While you can try to reduce risk, you can't eliminate it. And then resilience lies in being able to bounce back quickly and in being able to minimize the damage that is faced. So this regulatory framework and architecture then has to have those institutions and mechanisms that prepare for failure. Now, this is something that has been done, say, even actually in the banking system after the 1930s, when there were banking crises and then repeated banking crises. We certainly don't want that there should be crisis and that there should the answer comes after as a response to the crisis. So CDRI is more like a body that has been trying to preempt that need for the crisis, to that it's not that you need a crisis and then the G20 comes up, but you try to prevent that need. I think one of the biggest challenges that is faced is that while many of the risks that are increasing, as you spoke about earlier, are because of, say, climate change, where the cause is global, but the impact is local. And that actually increases the challenges to coming to this. So what can what can governments do to get more get the private sector to build more resilient infrastructure? I think my answer would lie in creating, at least starting to create those regulatory frameworks, the supervisory frameworks, as well as preparation for failure, which of course we go down deeper into detail into it, means that you talk about insurance and you don't want moral hazard. You don't want that, the typical problems of insurance, which are asymmetric information and moral hazard. You don't want that the taxpayer should pay and therefore people should be taking more risks. So how do you tackle those? And you have to get into the difficulties of those. But without that sort of a very broad system level, multi-sectoral, multi-regulator approach and them coming together, it's, the private sector will always try to cut costs and get out of its responsibilities. There will be asymmetric information and moral hazard. So I think that's the role of the government, and that's how they need to step in and start thinking about how we can go forward on this and bring the private sector in.
Great, thank you very much. You raised a number of really important points, not least appropriate risk-sensitive regulations and supervisory frameworks, requirements on disclosure, the ability to bounce back. We will be talking about risk transfer a little later in the panel, and of course asymmetric information, which exists on both sides, both on the side of government and on the side of private sector. So a lot of food for thought there. I'd like to shift the focus now specifically to green solutions, to nature-based solutions, and to Jaya Dindor, as I mentioned, Program Director of Integrated Urban Development at WRI India. So Jaya, the integration of nature-based with grey solutions is potentially a more cost-effective way to build resilient infrastructure. But is it easy to raise financing in this relatively innovative areas, in areas where perhaps people aren't always as familiar with assessing the costs and benefits? And what measures are required to increase the financing availability to take this very important area forward?
Thank you, Charlie, and thank you, CDRI, for convening this very important conversation, the 2 days that we have together here. I think, Charlie, I'll answer your question in 3 parts. I'll start with basically a quick definition of what we mean by nature-based solutions, because I think it has come up a few times in previous conversations, but I think the clarity on what that means to different people is different things. I'll just talk about the barriers to financing, and then maybe offer 2 ways or solutions by which some of these barriers can be overcome to answer whether it's cost effective and how do we go forward. So I think first on nature-based solutions, IUCN has their definition, but basically we are talking about approaches that protect, restore, and manage natural ecosystems. And so by that we mean solutions for the nature, by the nature, of the nature. That's a very simple definition of that, okay? And essentially, how they differ from other engineered solutions is that they offer simultaneous economic, ecological, and equity benefits to society. So ecological in terms of soil, carbon sequestration, etc. And that's the ecological part of it. The economic is in terms of, the green jobs, the livelihoods created, and also resource efficiency. And then the equity part of it in terms of, health outcomes for people who are near these solutions, their ability to adapt to climate change, access to services, etc. Now, they also have, three different types of functions and three different types of ways in which they can be applied. So one is we can apply them directly. So for example, wetlands for water filtration. We can use that to enhance engineered solutions. So for example, planting trees for, reservoir desiltation. And then to enhance engineered assets actually, which means agroforestry for preventing landslides on slopes and roads that are next to slopes. So that's basically, how we would like to think of and, define nature-based solutions, and that's where it becomes sort of this infrastructure thing. I think it's commonly understood that NBS offers cost-effective and low-carbon ways of building resilient infrastructure, but there are several challenges when it comes to how do you finance them. So most of these are stemming from really political will. And why political will? Because there is very little evidence to support their impact and their effectiveness, especially in the global south. There's also incentives which are not there because it's an area which is not understood very well, so the incentives are not there or they're not aligned well. Then there's also the question of the evidence and the capacities, therefore. There isn't capacity within city agencies, within organizations to deliver these solutions. There aren't specifications around that. So, all of that becomes sort of one bundle of challenges for implementation. Operations and maintenance models, great, you put a nature-based solution in, but who's going to maintain it? Who's going to pay for it? That becomes another challenge. And I think the other, underlying cause is that the way we function, the department budgets and allocations are completely siloed. So there is no option for an integrated approach to building infrastructure, building resilient infrastructure. And this is all sort of a manifestation of a lack of understanding, basically, of what these solutions can do and evidence on that count. So I think just in terms of numbers, when we come to, the kind of solutions that might be there, and how do you finance it, right now, globally, about $154 billion has been invested in nature-based solutions. To achieve the kind of climate goals and biodiversity goals that we have for ourselves globally, that investment will have to almost double to about $384 billion by 2025, right? So the scale and speed at which we need these solutions to kind of come up, clearly, it needs to happen. We're in 2023, it needs to happen in the next 2 years. 92% of the funding currently on nature-based solutions is coming from G20 countries and funding that they offer. Only 17% is coming from the private sector. And so that offers an opportunity for us to see where can we scale up, orders of magnitude scale up private sector investment towards nature-based solutions and its implementation. So I think one of the responses to the finance question is blended finance is perhaps going to be the way if we're going to look at private sector stepping into this space and for unlocking the investments that we need. And for this, the important thing to do will be to build a pipeline of bankable projects, right? So most cities, most agencies don't have a pipeline of bankable projects. They have ideas, they have projects that need to be done on water, sewerage, they need to extend lines by so many meters, kilometers, etc. But they don't have projects which are bankable, which are ready to be pitched for funding, especially for blended finance. And I'll give you just two quick solutions that I'm seeing which sound to be promising. One is a solution by WRI India called the CityFix Labs. Another is the Land Accelerator. The CityFix Labs for Nature-Based Solutions is looking to bring in MSME and the private sector and startups who are offering solutions in the space of nature-based solutions, and help by offering them low-risk pilots so that this is de-risked for the government, who would be the largest entity that can scale such projects up, and then offering them some money to do these pilots at a low cost, demonstrate the efficacy of these solutions, and then move forward. So the CityFix Labs is one way that we're doing it. The Land Accelerator is similarly looking at restoration projects in Africa and Asia, and also is looking at promoting entrepreneurs who are working in this space to help them demystify NBS for the government a little bit so that they can get into government contracts, looking at ways in which government access can be had. The other one that I'll just mention very quickly is the ACWA Fund, ACWA, that is the African Cities Water Adaptation Fund, which has been set up. This was announced last year. Again, the goal of this is to help projects in 100 African cities on adaptation projects in 100 African cities, nature-based solution projects, and basically do it in a way which offers full project lifecycle support. We're looking to pool funding for this to the tune of about $5 billion by 2032. And the pooled funding will come from concessional grants, basically your equity, debt, grants, philanthropy money. The idea is to kind of look at all of those sources as pooled funding for this. And those are two options. There's another one that's being tested in San Francisco framework that WRI has come up with. It's called the Joint Benefits Authority. And basically that's looking at bringing different city agencies together for the planning, funding, delivery, and operations and maintenance of nature-based solutions on the premise that when you plant trees or when you provide nature-based solution projects in a city, there are multiple departments who are benefiting from it one way or another. There's co-benefits that are to be had, say whether it's the transit, utilities department, schools, parks, and how about we pool some amount of the funding from those departments together and create this independent entity which can then, help sort of proliferate the concept of NBS. So I'll stop there, Charlie, but happy to speak more about this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jaya. That figure you've just said, we need to basically double what we've spent so far on nature-based solutions by 2025. That is quite some feat, particularly given those barriers, as you indicated, not least political will, siloed line agency budgets within government, and of course evidence. I think evidence at least is something that hopefully CDRI is able to come in, and of course it's one of the work streams under the G20 Disaster Risk Reduction Working Group, but clearly a huge amount to be done, and very, very, very quickly to really meet the need. I'd like to turn now to Vijay Kalavakonda, Senior Financial Sector Specialist at IFC at the International Finance Corporation, which of course is the private sector arm of the World Bank Group. Vijay, perhaps you could share with us how IFC is helping countries to improve the bankability of resilient infrastructure projects, and so to enhance the availability of private financing in this area. And could you also perhaps let us know how IFC itself screens all its investments to ensure that they are indeed climate and disaster resilient? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Charlie. It's a pleasure to be on this panel with all the distinguished members on the panel as well. For those of you, who do not know much about IFC, as Charlie mentioned, we are the private sector arm of the World Bank Group. And our investment is when we do also do investment in the subnational space, basically lending money to the municipal corporations. And we do it on a non-sovereign basis. So any investment, if it's a debt investment or an equity investment, we basically take the typical market-based approach, and all the risks, whatever there are, it's all purely market-based approach that we take. So we are not dependent on any sovereign guarantees being taken, unlike by the World Bank. I just wanted to put that, upfront so that people understand, the way IFC looks at some of these things. So within IFC, if you look, we have three sort of a major offerings. One is, the primary of which is investment to basically help support investments in infrastructures and various other spaces. The second is what we call as the advisory arm, wherein we basically provide a lot of technical assistance and support to basically help clients. And in this case, particularly as we are working in the subnational space, more particularly to see how we can basically develop more bankable projects, because that is, I think, one of the key issues and challenges that we see. And finally, we do have another arm, which is called as a public-private partnership or transaction advisory arm, or the PPP team, wherein we try to basically work with the governments, with various authorities to basically develop PPP sort of structures for crowding in investments and also making those projects much more sort of a bankable in that sense. Within IFC, if you look at, we have been constantly, coming up with new sort of tools to basically help our clients. As several of you might know that, IFC was at the forefront in developing the EDGE tool, which is basically to help in terms of, doing the green building sort of an approaches, that these buildings that are basically being constructed or basically resilient or green and less carbon emitting and things of those sort. IFC was at the forefront. And today, if you see globally, I think it's becoming one of the sort of a good global standards, and a lot of financial institutions are basically starting to adopt the EDGE tool. The recent example is that even in India, we recently cracked it with lending that we did to HDFC to the tune of about $350 million, which is specifically to promote green building and green housing, and wherein the support will be provided through the EDGE tool is one thing that we have developed as an institution. We are proud to say that. Another tool, similarly, what we have developed is something called as an APEX tool, which is primarily to basically help our clients, in this case, subnationals or other government entities, to see how they could basically, what are the different strategies or policy options they can undertake in terms of reducing the carbon footprint. And we give them different scenarios of what are the different strategies they can take to basically reduce the carbon footprint and what sort of an investments are required, And in the case of India, we did a study for the Ahmedabad Municipal Corporation, and wherein we basically did a complete analysis as to how much it would cost to the Ahmedabad Municipal Corporation if they have to basically move towards a path of reducing the carbon footprints by almost around 50% of what their current emission rates are by 2025. And we basically looked at various sectors, looking at the affordable housing space. We looked at the sort of a material recycling facilities that they have, how they can basically enhance investments in renewable energy space, how they could look at promoting electric vehicles, how do they manage the legacy sort of a waste management within the municipal corporation and all the waste management practices they're basically having in place. So these APEX tools basically give that insight to the policymakers and to the city planners in terms of what sort of an investment they could basically undertake to help in terms of reduction of the emissions. The latest one is that we've also been working, for example, we sat with the government of Kerala to basically help them on two aspects. One is one is in the space of helping them on their water and waste management plans, wherein we basically helped in terms of trying to see how we could basically train and streamline the climate resilience and their infrastructure planning related activities. Similarly, we also basically helped in terms of mainstreaming the green building sort of tools in building of their hospitals, given there is a huge network of hospitals, both the new ones and also the existing ones, how could they basically improve these buildings and basically make them more compliant with green sort of standards. And as IFC, we were more than happy to basically also provide them the necessary investment support funding to basically make this happen. So we work with several of these stakeholders. The latest example is we've been engaged with the Greater Visakhapatnam Municipal Corporation, wherein they are basically keen in terms of using the treatment of the wastewater and the treated water basically going to the industrial hubs for basically for industry to be supplied to the industries. So there again, I think we are basically engaging with some of these municipal corporations to see how we can basically support them and basically strengthen some of these offering and expand some of these offerings as well. One of the major things that we have done across in several cities and states in India is on the street lighting, wherein that's been a major initiative of ours. We've been involved with several corporations, the Bhubaneswar Municipal Corporation, the Bangalore Municipal Corporation, Bihar, and several other states to basically help in terms of how can we basically help in terms of transitioning and bringing in more energy efficiency in the street lightings that are basically undertaken by the states. So those are sort of a technical assistance and advisory support that we basically provide to our clients to make them more sort of resilient in terms of their infrastructure needs and other things. Towards the second question, Charlie, about do we basically do screening of all our investments for climate and resiliency? I think, let me put it this way. I think today there cannot be any investment which will go through our board wherein, it's a business as usual, meaning if you are basically investing in a manufacturing business or we are investing in an infrastructure business, if, it's a business as usual, these investments will not clear the muster in our board. So we have to very clearly show, even when we are basically, providing investments in several of the manufacturing facilities as well, we have to very clearly show that there is a decarbonization pathway that is being adopted by our investee clients. Similarly, when you're talking about infrastructure, we have to be very clear that these are basically not contributing to additional sort of emissions, but are contrary to that, basically helping in terms of reduction. And today, if you see the recent study that was published by the World Bank Group with respect to the urban infrastructure financing requirement, the estimated requirement is close to about almost about $800 billion by over the next 10 years. And what we see from IFC is that, and as a World Bank Group as a whole, almost around 80-90% plus of this investment is all in the space of resilient and climate-related financing requirements. I don't think any of the investment that will go into the cities is going to be outside of the resiliency, outside of the climate financing sort of a needs. So by default, to be honest, I think most of the projects that we will be taking to the board will have to basically, confirm to some of these sort of matrices. So let me pause there and maybe I'll come back at a later stage.
Thank you very much, Vijay. There's clearly a lot of work going on to encourage and secure investments in green and low carbon infrastructure. And to ensure, of course, that business as usual investments are no longer accepted. I'm sure you've just generated a lot of interest in the EDGE and the APEX tools. Hopefully they are available online and accessible to all. I'd like to turn now to our representative from academia on the panel, to Professor Ilan Noy, Chair in the Economics of Disasters and Climate Change at the School of Economics and Finance, Victoria University of Wellington in New Zealand. So Ilan, obviously the public and private sectors need to work closely together to secure increased investments in resilience, not least because most infrastructure has certain public good characteristics. What opportunities as well as challenges and obstacles do you see in this regard in that engagement of public and private sector?
Kia ora, Charlie, and namaste to everyone, and apologies for being online rather than in person with you in Delhi. I would have loved to be there. What are the challenges and the opportunities here? We clearly need a lot of money, new money for infrastructure, and the public sector doesn't have enough money to provide this. So we do need other sources of funding, but there are a lot of risks when we think about using private money to finance infrastructure. And I want to just highlight a few. Ilya already talked about the fact that we sort of need to tame the tiger of the private money when we are thinking about infrastructure through supervision and regulation. But I think the challenges go even maybe beyond that. Largely when we're thinking about infrastructure, we're thinking about very, very long-term horizons. So typically maybe even 100 years, even if the life cycle of the infrastructure itself is less than that, say 50, 60, 70 years, the assets that are built around it might last for a lot longer. So we need to think about very, very long term. And the private sector is not geared to thinking that long term. Public sector is not always thinking much further than the next election, but still, I think with good institutional setups, then there is this thinking for the long term. So that's one challenge. The other challenge is, of course, and Ila already talked a little bit about this, is the tension between the profit-seeking motive of the private sector and the well-being that we get from infrastructure, that those can clash, and often do. I had the unfortunate luck to be in California in the 1990s when California privatized its electricity production system. And then the private producers realized that if they cut supply, prices will go up, and they will make, you know, a bucket load of money, which is exactly what we did. They did, and we had to live through rolling blackouts in California for a couple of years before the government realized they need to strengthen their regulation of electricity production. That's clearly an example of the way the profit motive clashes with the public interest. The other issue is, of course, that the infrastructure is, as Charlie, as you intimated, is a public good. It creates a positive externality. And by definition, those externalities are those considerations which we don't evaluate when we are when the decision makers are deciding about investment opportunities, for example. So what we have is, with positive externalities, we always have undersupply of these goods. So that's why almost universally public goods are undersupplied. The private sector is even worse, of course, in providing public goods than the public sector is. So how do we overcome this? It's much more difficult to internalize positive externalities than it is to internalize negative externalities. You know, the classic example of a negative externality is pollution. It's easier from a regulatory perspective to internalize pollution by, for example, taxing the polluter than it is to internalize a positive externality. So the benefit that society gets from a piece of investment. So it's a challenge to get the private sector to internalize these externalities. The last thing is that there's always risk with any investment, and especially when we mix public money and private money, where that risk exactly ends up landing is not always clear, and a lot of times the private part assumes that the risk is on the public sector. And a lot of times when sort of push comes to shove, it does indeed land on the public sector lap. So we sometimes have the public sector funding risk, sometimes unaware that they are backing risk that the private sector is undertaking. And we have plenty of examples of that from all over the world, and that's a risk that we want to make sure doesn't happen. So there's plenty of challenges in trying to make sure that private money is supplying the public good benefit that we get from good resilient infrastructure, which suggests to me that we need a lot of public money in it. And where that money has to come from, well, depends on which country you sit in. But in some countries, it will have to come from you know, Charlie's employer, for example, the Asian Development Bank. But in other countries, it will have to come from the government. But there needs to be a massive increase in public investment in resilient infrastructure. So it's not enough to just think that the private sector can sort of save us from this challenge. I'll end there, and I'm happy to take questions later on. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much, Ilan. Of course, you highlight the need for very significant financing, public-private, but that challenges in drawing private sector financing into the infrastructure space. You also mentioned contingent liability that ultimately falls on government when systems fail, when disasters happen. And that's actually an excellent segue, if I may, to our final panelist, who is deliberately at the end, because with Michael Spranger, consultant with Miyamoto, he's also an insurance specialist, and we wanted to ask you, Michael, about insurance. As you know, it would be prohibitively costly to build infrastructure to withstand the most extreme natural hazards. There will always be some residual risk. And so as such, it's also important to prepare for disasters, including to prepare financially, which is where risk transfer insurance markets step in. So in that regard, how can we help both public and private sector increase their coverage, the availability, the uptake of risk transfer products such as insurance?
Well, thank you very much, Charlie, for this question. First of all, thank you very much for having me at this conference. I hope you can hear me. I'm using the hand mic because I find it more convenient. It's a question, I think, that is accompanying us for at least 2-3 decades of our professional career. Of course, we're now changing a little bit the perspective, looking on how we would deal with financial consequences of disasters that happen now, right now, with the existing risk landscape, with the existing infrastructure, with the existing housing stock, etc. And I think over the years we did make some progress, but yet we can see that, let's say, in developed or economically very strong countries, 60, 70, maybe 80% of the financial consequences are actually transferred to the private sector. Where we have, on the other hand, countries economically least or less developed, where this number is in the single digit and maybe even in the lower single digit range. So we're in only 3, 5, 7% of the risk is transferred to the private sector, or in general subject to risk transfer, I would say. So this is a daunting number, I think, and I'd like to pick up something that we heard earlier this morning, the sense of urgency, because nature will not wait for us. And economists are telling us, of course, how countries are affected, how they are thrown back in time, basically, if they are not, at least to a certain standard, prepared for such an impact that can happen anytime, as we know. Earthquakes are not predictable, they can happen. And we just saw this example this morning. Kit showed the numbers on the Turkey earthquake with 50,000 fatalities, 10,000 buildings, and the enormous loss of financial loss that we experienced 2 months ago in Turkey. So, what can we do? I don't have the silver bullet, I'm sorry. Although we try to work, and with we, in this case, I mean the whole disaster risk financing community, I think, on that for, as I said, 10, 20 years. So, but maybe I can reflect on a couple of issues that we maybe have to solve or get better at. And let me start with the kind of products that we are offering, actually. I still believe that, although this is the area where I think we made most progress, I think they still are a bit supply-driven rather than demand-driven, meaning that I, as the expert, because I developed a model, I understand where your financial gap is, I come to a country and say, do you know, I have a problem there, I have a solution for you. And that often obviously doesn't work. So the part of making that tailor-made solutions really for the countries, or for the communities we're speaking to, is one of the issues where I think we have to get better. And that requires obviously a collaborative and a longer discussion approach that goes back and forth, because we do have something that was also mentioned in the different contexts, a language issue here, that not necessarily all the technical details that I might express one way are understood exactly the same way. That is true between, let's say, the disaster risk financing expert and the communities, but it's also true in the other direction, saying when we're speaking to the modeling people, the technicians, sometimes scientists, that obviously do not have the direct practical exchange with the client, not necessarily. So that's an area I think where we still have to improve, getting better, work more collaboratively. And I think that's a learning process that takes time, although I just said we don't actually have time because nature is not waiting for us. But I think we have to go through this. Then I think we have a different aspect to that as well, which is we have many different tools. We speak about insurance because it is the biggest chunk probably of disaster risk financing, but actually we do have different other tools that we are offering. Be it cat bonds, be it contingency lines, loans. There are a couple of tools that we have in our toolkit. And I think combining them in a meaningful way for the exact situation that we're facing with this particular country, region, community, peril, is something that actually we have to get better at. I mean, we all speak normally about something like a layered approach. This is the common sense how we would like to structure that. But in reality, if you look close enough, you will see that there are gaps in there. There are different triggers for different tools. So there might be gaps in the coverage for the countries. There are differences in price, and it's not always best going for the cheapest one for certain, let's say, severities of events. So there we definitely have to work within the disaster risk financing community a bit closer, I would say, and offer maybe one package of products to the clients in the end of the day. I think that is something, because it is confusing. We have kind of the too many cooks syndrome there, that everybody, of course, is promoting one part of the disaster risk financing solution, but we all have slightly different recipes of doing that, which is sometimes confusing to the members. I think that is another issue. I think there is huge room for improvement actually in terms of efficiency and transparency. So these tools, I mean, disaster insurance is a very intangible thing. So it's very difficult to explain that, and it takes a lot of effort showing what that actually means. Even practitioners in the countries, I often realize in discussions that they still, although they are, let's say they're purchasing a catastrophe insurance for a certain peril, yet they do not fully understand actually what is covered, how it exactly works, and why. So I think transparency in this respect is very important. So visualizing actually what is really under the hood is an issue where we could get better as well as in terms of financial efficiency. I mean, some of these tools are still more expensive, I would say, than they would have to be. And I'm saying that with the head of the private sector here. That is simply true that we have to improve there a little bit. And finally, I think one of the issues, and again I'm picking up something from this morning, is what is the motivation of a country to really purchase disaster risk financing elements? What is the benefit in the short term for the country? And I think there we are not doing a really good job. I mean, obviously we have it clear that in the long term the economic recovery is much faster, the impact is much lower. We understand that theoretically, but not necessarily on the other side is seen exactly the same way.
Thank you, Michael. If I could perhaps stop you there. So really useful insights, not least the need to ensure that we actually have tailor-made products that are appropriate to the particular financing needs of individual clients, and also the need to improve understanding of those products, particularly, of course, on the part of the clients themselves, understanding the underlying modelling, why a particular solution is being proposed. I would certainly be a big advocate, by the way, for contingent disaster grants and loans as a sort of starter product for countries looking to put in place some advanced financing arrangements to ensure some immediate liquidity post-disaster. We have so completed our first round of questions. We are very tight for time, but if there are any questions from the floor, we would love to hear from you, or any questions from our audience online.
There's a question.
Where's the question?
It's right in front.
Oh, great. Thank you. We have a question. Excellent. If you could just tell us your name and your organization as well, please. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Sakshi and I have a question on behalf of CDRI. You have extensive and expansive experience on financing, that's very clear from this session. But we dealing with different countries at different scale and different stages of development, how these countries face infrastructure financing and risk transfer challenges are very different and diverse. What would be the two most critical tools and solutions that CDRI could equip itself to offer to meet these challenges put forth by these countries?
Thank you very much. And we also have one online question. I'm not quite sure who this is from, but the question is, what kind of innovative financing instruments and collaborations are needed regarding assessment of technical, social, and organizational domains of critical infrastructure system resilience? So two questions. Unfortunately, we don't have time to put all of these questions, both of these questions, to every single person. But perhaps I could have a volunteer to answer one of these questions, and then a volunteer for the other one. Who's feeling enthusiastic, brave, wanting to come in? Michael, you're...
I would be happy.
Oh, great. Please go ahead. Sorry, I don't know actually who said that. Who said they would be happy? Please go ahead, Ilan.
Just talking about innovative finance. My perception is that we don't need innovative finance, we need finance. Innovative finance is oftentimes finance where the risk is hidden in some sophisticated financial derivative instrument. And I think it's more risky than not in this context of resilient infrastructure when we are talking about very long-term investments. So we need more money in the table and not more sophisticated financial instruments. That would be my answer to that question.
Thank you.
I can go for the first one, if you like.
Dr. Patnaik, go ahead.
Okay, so I think that the one thing, we can come to two later, the one thing that CDRI can do is emphasize the role of disclosure. And, given that there are different conditions in different markets, different amounts, different investment needed and so on, and it's costly, the one thing that doesn't cost much is just asking for disclosure. These could be standardized. These could be like the 10 things that we all agree on, which could be, disclosed by both people who maintain projects or people who create projects. And that would bring transparency and measurement. Thanks.
Thank you very much. So we are now down to just our last few minutes, and we are going to have just a very quick fire round of questions to the panelists. If I could ask you to actually cut your responses to just 1 minute, if possible, and we'll see how we do here. I'd like to begin with Henry. So Henry, how can we work differently to attract greater financing for resilient infrastructure over the next decade or so?
Thank you. And I'd like to make it very quick and also hopefully answer some of the questions that were just asked as well. I think one aspect that is not exactly finance, but actually requires a significant amount of finance, really the role of technology. I think there's still a lot that need to be financed for new R&D, obviously, but also I think what we've seen, and maybe that's one of the roles CDRI could play, is really accelerating the exchange of knowledge when it comes to solutions. I mean, I mentioned technology, but solution more generally. We still see, I think, in the world of resilience, I think too many is not invented here yet type of issues. And that goes all the way to sort of financing mechanisms that actually enable, investment in resilience in different places. So we're doing that actually in partnership with 7 MEVs, trying to sort of address the issues around resilient roads and sustainable roads. And obviously, we're very much looking forward to be able to share some of the learnings on that. And I think just, again, in the spirit of collaboration, I think there's also a lot of, I wouldn't necessarily call them innovation, but de-risking instruments that are being used in order to sort of get more private sector in without necessarily transferring the entire risk onto the public sector. And I think those are popping in here and there, but we still see a lot of not invented here yet type of issues. And I think that could be definitely one of the roles of CDRI as well, to sort of make sure that when they do capacity building, they highlight those innovations that have worked in other places. I'll stop there. And I think probably more collaborative way across countries is the one of the answer.
Thank you very much. Vijay, perhaps I could turn to you now. What do you think is the future of financing for resilient infrastructure over the next decade?
Charlie, as I mentioned in my earlier session, is that, even if you take just India, the urban infrastructure financing needs, we see almost around 80-90% of the infrastructure financing needs in the urban infrastructure, which is to the tune of more than about close to about $800 billion. I think these are all in the space of resiliency, investing in green building, green infrastructure or sustainable infrastructure, resilient infrastructure, you name it, in any different way you want to give. And I think a large part of it in terms of the financing, whether clients are going to be borrowing and investing, is also going to be driven by how the G20, the G7, the G20 are going to step up in terms of providing financing as well. I think what we are already seeing in our engagement today, even in markets like India and in several other markets, is the clients are asking for blended financing, and which requires concessional financing coming in from the donors, be it the EU, be it the US, be it other developed countries. And if we go by the past track record, it's not very encouraging, where the G7 committed that they would be providing about $100 billion towards every year for climate financing. Nothing has happened much, And in terms of basically scaling it up in a big way, in terms of resilient financing, I think a lot is also going to be depending on how the international community is going to step up. And that is going to basically help in terms of more and more of investment going in and supporting resiliency in infrastructure and resiliency in various aspects of the economy as well. Let me stop there.
Jaya, how do you expect financing for nature-based solutions to evolve over the next decade? Will we reach that 2025 need?
Yes, I think to me, honestly, blended finance is the way forward on nature-based solutions and on many of the sort of climate action solutions that we're looking for. But for that to actually come into being and for us to realize its full potential, there's a lot of work that will need to happen upstream. So for example, we have the India Forum for Nature-Based Solutions. It's a collective of the foremost research and practice organizations working on nature-based solutions in India, across many countries. And we've come together to say there are 3 things we are going to demystify. One is, build the evidence, basically, and a common language around nature-based solutions, understanding. The second is build capacity amongst a variety of stakeholders, which means financing institutions, government, private sector. And the third is to help enable policy shifts in a way that mainstream nature-based solutions and the regulations that are needed to kind of catch up with that. So I think that's the kind of work that will need to happen upstream for us to reach, potentially reach the 2025 goal. But I also want to say that investment in nature-based solutions is crucial. But that alone is not going to save the planet. And I want to just say that, two words of caution. One is that we need to be very careful that nature-based solutions does not fall into that gap of greenwashing, and we do the wrong things in the wrong places. And the second is that, yes, NBS is good, but not NBS at all costs. There will be negative externalities associated even with the solution that sounds good and promising. So I think we really need to weigh our pros and cons to make sure that we're not doing the wrong things. So basically what we'll need is a lot of government intervention and radical collaborations between unlikely partners for all of this to kind of fructify in the future. Thank you.
Thank you. Michael, what growth and developments can we expect in the risk transfer market over the coming decade?
I think we will advance at a faster speed with closing this protection gap that we spoke in the beginning. And I think there are a couple of reasons for that, and that make me so optimistic about that. One is a little bit cynical to start with, which is climate change, because it raises risk awareness. It's in everybody's mind at the moment. On top of that, I mean, we have something like the GEARI index that was presented yesterday, which was a fantastic tool to promote that and show that. That was not possible without computer power that is increasing significantly. We have a very active and proliferative insurtech scene that actually develops, in my view, new tools that allows us to provide coverages that we were not able to do with other tools before. And I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you. Ilan, what about you? What challenges, slightly different question, what challenges will we need to overcome to achieve the progress that some of these other panelists envisage or hoping for?
Yeah, so in a sense, it's an easy challenge because there's so many low-hanging fruit. And the social returns to good resilient infrastructure is so high that you could think that where is the challenge? It's clearly we need to invest more in resilient infrastructure, and the economic case for it, or the social case for it, is quite clear. What we need to do is convince the people who hold the purse strings, and my colleague from the IFC mentioned the G7 commitments through the UNFCCC process. We need more investment, and we need more public money globally in this space. That's why we need organizations like CDRI that are pushing on that at exactly that agenda, and we need to convince the governments of the world to invest more in resilient infrastructure.
Thank you. And finally, Dr. Patnaik, what final message would you like to convey from the private sector to policymakers to help ensure that we secure a substantial increase in investment in resilient infrastructure?
I would say that the private sector and companies like ours that have been there for 150 years and are responsible businesses are actually very, very interested in building infrastructure, helping build infrastructure that is resilient, because we are the biggest gainers. Our markets expand. So we would very much like to be part of helping shape those frameworks. We would very much like to be part of even identifying what are the problems, what are the obstacles, where is it that policy frameworks need to change so that we can move ahead on that path, and so that governments can provide enabling frameworks so that we have that, so that we are able to partner with government. These will have to be done at national levels, but I think CDRI can play a very, very important role. It can create these discussion forums to begin with, at in every country, in countries like India, where it is easy for public-private partnerships to happen. They just have to come together together, talk much more, and identify problems, figure out solutions, and find ways to address them. And we would very much like to be part of that.
Great, and what a wonderfully positive note to end on. Thank you. So we are out of time, but I would like to thank all the panelists very much for their very valuable views, ideas on ways forward. I also note there's been a number of suggestions to CDRI coming out of this, a number of roles that have been identified for CDRI, including around knowledge, building knowledge and evidence, discussion forums, principle setting, and advocacy. So I hope there's been some good note-taking to pick up on all of these excellent suggestions. Please could you join me in giving a round of applause to all of our panelists. Thank you. Did you want to present the certificates to the panelists? So for our online panelists, I understand you are going to be sent e-certificates. Perhaps you'd like to explain what these actually are.
These are 3 certificates.
Here you go.
As for my best knowledge, these are 3 certificates. So they've planted a tree in your name, in the name of all of our panelists, and we would like to thank you. It's a token of appreciation for all the panelists. Thank you.
So thank you very much. That's a really lovely idea. So online panelists, make sure you open those certificates.
If you can get up, then she'll just give it to us.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Sure. Let me just put that one down. So Jaya, thank you very much. And Michael, thank you.
Thank you, Joe.
Thank you. Thank you. I think we're still wired.
Yeah. We can just get off and take it off.
And then we can talk. I just missed my pen.
Do we need to